Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and I am coming to this podcast today in search of restoration. Let me explain. There are times, I think, when we are all struggling in our own way with the big and small struggles that life offers us. And I've been in a bit of a state of struggle for a while now with some personal things going on. And I know that's the case for likely many people who are listening. Life is beautiful, but of course, challenging, So I was feeling kind of low today, and I thought, I usually want to reserve when I record these episodes for when I'm in an especially happy place or introspective place. And I thought, maybe it would be better today when all I really want is to read this book and talk about this book, to just do that and not make sure that I'm ready to do it, but just do it. So that's what we're doing today. So I appreciate you tuning in to listen as we continue on. We are on episode 19 at this point, and we are heading into another reflection or short essay from Michael this week. Now, I don't want to hold off any longer. I want to get right into it. So get cozy and get comfortable and join me for reading this week's piece, and it's called Trust. Trust. As I was feeding squirrels in the park, I noticed a small one that didn't seem to trust me. While the others came close enough to eat out of my hand, he kept his distance. I threw a peanut his way. He edged up, grabbed it nervously, and ran off. Next time, he must have felt less afraid because he came a little closer. The safer he felt, the more he trusted me. Finally, he sat right next to my feet, as bold as any squirrel clamoring for the next peanut. Trust is like that. It always seems to come down to trusting in yourself. Others can't overcome fear for you. You have to do it on your own. It's hard because fear and doubt hold on tight. We are afraid of being rejected, of being hurt once more, so we keep a safe distance. We think separating ourselves from others will protect us, but that doesn't work either. It leaves us feeling alone and unloved. Trusting yourself begins by recognizing that it's okay to be afraid. Having fear is not the problem, because everyone feels anxious and insecure sometimes. The problem is not being honest enough to admit your fear. Whenever I accept my own doubt and insecurity, I'm more open to other people. The deeper I go into myself, the stronger I become, because I realize that my real self is much bigger than any fear. In accepting yourself completely, trust becomes complete. There is no longer any separation between people because there is no longer any separation inside. In the space where fear used to live, love is allowed to grow. Well, I am so pleased that on a day like today, this is the piece I am reading. I've said this before, but I do feel sometimes like I read these exactly when I need to read them. And I guess I sort of enjoy the serendipity of such a thing happening so often. Now, part of that is, of course, so many of Michael's pieces have universal themes. But maybe also it's divine. I like to think both. I like to think both things are true at once. This piece has so much going on in it, and there's a lot I'd like to unpack in this piece, my immediate impressions of it, and moments that I've really thought through the most. So of course I love the opening paragraph, envisioning Michael. I'm imagining him like sitting up against a tree while these little squirrels crowd around him, and he's paying attention to the one that's more afraid than the others. And there's just something very sweet about it. This is unrelated, but I recently rewatched Disney's Cinderella, the animated film, and it reminds me of the little mice and how they befriend her. But it made me think specifically of the chubby little mouse, Gus, who is all afraid and defensive until he realizes he can trust everyone, the other mice in Cinderella. Listen, this is just what came to mind, okay? But it's very sweet. It's very sweet. This image of Michael feeding these squirrels and, paying attention to them this way is adorable. Who knows if it's completely accurate, and who knows when it took place even, because I always imagine that the pieces that we're reading were written at some point in the previous, 5 years or so. But that doesn't mean they were, first of all. And it also doesn't mean that they were based on things that even happened recently, if they happened at all. So we all know that Michael loved to befriend animals from the time he was a small child, befriending mice that lived in the house. So it's believable that this could have, if it did, it could have happened at any time. But I want to believe that whenever it did legitimately stay with him as a reminder of this whole concept of trust. What I find really interesting is that in the first paragraph, as he's describing trust among these squirrels, we could easily assume he's talking primarily about trusting other people, trusting those outside of ourselves. The squirrel did not trust him until some time had passed and he got to see that he was safe, and then he started to act like all the other squirrels. But immediately we transition to the second paragraph, and Michael says, "Trust is like that. It always seems to come down to you trusting in yourself." I find it interesting because he presents the scenario of a squirrel not trusting a stranger, and then immediately follows up with saying, trust is about trusting in yourself. It always comes down to trusting in yourself. And I thought that was interesting because ultimately, he's right. I mean, our ability to trust in strangers or to trust in others is also about trusting in ourselves and trusting in our own ability to determine who and what is safe, to recognize signs of danger, to believe that you are good enough, to believe that you are smart enough, kind enough, talented enough to be accepted and not rejected, to trust your ability to read a situation, to trust that you do know what's best for yourself. It's not only about trusting others, it's about trusting our own perception of others. If we tend to be a person that sees the worst in people or sees the best in people, or however we view the world, we often act as a result of those beliefs. But something I find really important to think about here is that there's also an element of trust in ourselves that comes down to trusting our own ability to deal with what life throws our way, trusting our own ability to survive a given situation or a challenging situation. Now, obviously, I'm talking primarily about like emotional or psychological survival. The stuff that drives most of our fear is those fears of being harmed or hurt in those ways. Of course, in addition to the physical fears we have. But I think this is an important distinction, because then think about what that means. When it comes to our ability to trust other people, is it about trusting them or is it about trusting ourselves? If we trust within ourselves that we can read a situation correctly, then we can go into that situation fairly confident. But even if we don't necessarily trust our perception of something, if we trust in our own ability to take care of ourselves, to bounce back, to survive, to manage no matter what, to pick ourselves up off the ground, no matter the circumstances, then we're also less likely to be afraid, because you can't possibly perceive everything accurately in life. I mean, you only have so much information as a person to base all of your judgments in the world off of. So as you judge and read other people, you can be completely, stunned by them, and both in good and bad ways. But if you have the trust within yourself, that you have that security within yourself, then you don't have to be afraid or as fearful of others. So it's interesting because this obviously fits together, but I don't think it's something that we think about often enough when it comes to our own engagement in the world. I'm speaking as the collective we here. I'm sure there's many very wise people who are listening and are like, I've always known this. But I certainly did not always know this. And the fundamental importance of having trust and faith and being secure within yourself is something that I think in my 30s is only when I've really come to truly understand that. I thought I understood it at one point when I was younger, but I didn't. In retrospect, I did not. When he says, others can't overcome your fear for you, you have to do it on your own, it makes sense. He's right. Fear is such an individualized thing. There can be two people in the same scenario and one will be afraid and one will not. There's different levels of fear and there's different ways we experience it. But either way, we can seek comfort and even accept comfort, but only our ability to disrupt our own sort of thinking patterns will be how we get out of it. He says, we think separating ourselves from others will protect us, but that doesn't work either. It leaves us feeling alone and unloved. And this makes a lot of sense when you're a person, if you've put your walls up to the world because you are trying to protect yourself. It's an understandable reaction to pain and fear, but walls keep out the good just as much as they keep out the bad. And as a person who has personally built up so many walls in my life and had to tear them back down in different ways, I certainly understand both sides of this. But again, walls keep out the good as much as they keep out the bad. And so, as he's saying, it comes down to us more than it comes down to those around us or the world. It's not saying we have to think one way or the other about the world, but rather that the ability to trust in ourselves can open up room for love and connection that we might be right now keeping at a distance, which I think is an important thing to be thinking about right now in this global moment. In the final 2 paragraphs, he reviews more about the connection between fear and trust. He says, trusting yourself begins by recognizing that it's okay to be afraid. Fear is interesting. I think fear is one of those emotions that feels the most vulnerable. And so we often cover it with things like anger and resentment, which is really just another kind of anger. When I think about what emotions we are allowed to experience as people, and I say that, in quotes, socially expected and accepted to experience as human beings, fear is one that I don't think is particularly encouraged. People make fun of other people for being afraid. People look at fear as weakness. It's highly vulnerable to admit when you're afraid, especially when you're afraid of something deep and dark within you or within the world. And so I feel like fear, understandably, gets replaced by anger and distance and coldness in some cases. Maybe even hate, whether self-hate or hate directed at other people. And it makes sense. It makes sense. It seems almost reasonable that that would be the case. But I don't know that it is. I think it, again, is logical. But is it reasonable? I think those things can be different. I think something can logically make sense for why our human experience would go in that direction and why our worldview would go in that direction. But I think it can also be not a reasonable view to hold on to And by reasonable, I guess I mean able to be held up to like a real scrutiny. Because when you begin to really question yourself and where do these negative emotions come from? And if they come from a root of fear, and where do those fears come from? So often the answer does lie within ourselves. Years ago, when I had gone through a very rough period of my life and had endured a lot of types of abuse. And over the years away from that and in attempts to heal, and also enduring it, but I would say especially in attempts to heal, I didn't really hate the people that had done things to me. I mostly hated myself for not knowing better and not being able to somehow predict that those things would have happened or be able to stand up to things that happened. And I feel that it makes sense, but again, it comes back down to the trust. Why didn't I trust in myself? Why did I not have trust in myself that I could handle any situation I was in, including ending relationships earlier than I did? There's just a lot there, and it's not to fault anyone. It's to say, as he said, the problem is not being honest enough to admit the fear, to admit it and confront it. And I suppose I'm thinking about this in part, and so moved by this in part because I'm in my own life stage where I'm having to confront a lot of fear in my day-to-day life and the prospects ahead. But it wouldn't be a Michael piece without it centering back on love in some way. And this is something I quite love about this piece, is how it ends. It ends with him talking about how self-acceptance doesn't just help drive away fear for your own experiences, but by driving away fear, we make room for love. If we're not afraid of people, we're not afraid of loving people. And if we're not afraid of loving people, then we're able to see people with love. And maybe that's the message of all of this. When we take care of ourselves, we confront the fear within ourselves, we learn to trust ourselves, then we can begin to pour out to other people and extend a hand and offer love or forgiveness or space or support or anything else. And it makes sense. Again, it makes sense. But my God, how challenging is that for all of us? I mean, again, we're at different levels of personal evolution, I'm sure. Every one of us, me as well as you listening. But how difficult, but how important also. I don't know, I'm really quite happy that I've read this today, because on a personal note, I often struggle with believing in myself for whatever reason. Trusting my own perspective, trusting my own abilities. There's only a few things about myself that I feel pretty consistent about. And I wonder how that is for others listening. And of course, I wonder what that is for Michael. I don't know if you've seen these before, but there are photos around the internet of notes he's written to himself in his lifetime, and things that you can read as affirmations where he's trying to find love and support for himself. He's trying to convince himself and believe in himself. So you can assume that they're based on his most intense insecurities. And he says things like, I am good enough and I am beautiful. And so we could assume, and I think a lot of us know, that those are probably the centerpieces of the insecurities he had that we're aware of. Again, at a distance, what can we know? Well, we know he had insecurities, just like anyone does, about his appearance, about if he was good enough, about if he would always retain and command the kind of attention that he sought, the kind of love that he sought. I have to admit, I've read Rabbi Shmuley's book about Michael, and it includes the transcripts of their many conversations, or at least, what we think are transcripts of them. I will amend that with all things we read, about anything really, with all things we read, we should question the process of how they were written. We should be curious about the curation of them. For example, these are transcripts from conversations. We don't know where those conversations began or ended, or if things were taken out of them. So with all of that, I think we can take most things with a grain of salt, and should, to be critical media consumers. But that said, I bring up the book because Michael, of course, talks about how he believes that at the core of everything he ever did was just a deep, deep desire to be loved. And any desire to be loved is something I think everyone can relate to. I mean, if there's one collective deep fear most people possess at least some point in their life, it's the fear that they're unlovable, right? And I hope for most of our sakes in this world, we work through that fear and we find a way to believe that we are, since we all are indeed lovable. But I believe that at the very, very deep, darkest root of many of us is a fear sort of like that is deep and dark and existential and not easily fixed with compliments or validation or, love or sex or anything else, but things that need to be addressed on a deeper, deeper level in a way that he's talking about here, where you have to be able to admit and recognize the fear in order to confront it. Now, how you do that and what you do once you recognize the deep fear, that's probably something for another episode and another set of words from Michael. But with that said, I really enjoy this piece a lot. I like that Michael in this book is offering works of poetry, works of sort of fictionalized accounts of spiritual or life lessons, but then also these very clear, straightforward assessments of life, where he's really offering a lesson from his own experience to us that I think is very, very useful and in his own way quite vulnerable to be able to admit as the biggest star in the world that you have these insecurities and that you have to admit to yourself when you're afraid and insecure, but that you have to trust in yourself. I think that's beautiful and it's authentic, and I am grateful for Michael's transparency here with his own very human experience. So thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode. I must say, I feel a lot better. And I don't know if it's just sitting with Michael's words or the focused energy on thinking about my own kind of inner self-trust. But I hope that for you, if you also were a person who turned to this podcast today for some restoration, or perhaps didn't even know you needed restoration, that you got a little bit of it and maybe got some inspiration from Michael's words as well, just as I did. So thank you. I look forward to hearing from you in the comments on Spotify. If you've never left comments, I would love to have some conversation there with you. But I also just really appreciate you tuning in week after week. It means a great deal to me. With that said, I look forward to meeting with you all next week. Until then, remember, it is okay to be afraid, but trust in yourself and all will be okay.